Donald Trump won the presidency twice, promising to reorient American politics. While not exactly anti-war, he was never a pacifist by any means. The Apprentice star wasn't as gung-ho as the neocons in the early 21st century. And unlike the Republican establishment more generally, he wanted to focus on blue-collar America through a project of reshoring American industry and addressing the failures of globalization. In other words, America first meant, well, putting America first. And no more stupid, avoidable wars was a foundation for all of that. That all now appears to have been thrown out of the window with the war on Iran. And those warmongering neocons, the old Republican establishment that Trump rallied against and defeated, well, they're loving it. A recent interview with Senator Ted Cruz on the YouTube channel Trigonometry was a great example of what I'm talking about. Have a watch.
Because there is a very real possibility in the next 6 months, we could see new governments in Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba. And if we end up with governments in those three countries that want to be friends with America rather than are enemies with America, that would be the biggest geopolitical shift since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now let me be clear. There are 1,000 ways that can go wrong. I'm not being Pollyannish and saying, oh, everything's wonderful. But on any objective level, the regimes there are weaker than they have been in our lifetimes. That is a moment of enormous opportunity. And so, look, at some level, it's going to be up to the people of Iran if they want a new government to step up and insist on that. I do think the president's putting pressure, weakening the regime and weakening the oppressive power of the regime makes them more vulnerable. And that, at the end of the day, I think that increases the safety of Americans.
The regime in Tehran was weaker in January. It was weaker at the start of February than it is today. And it was weaker because it didn't muster the kinds of democratic mass legitimacy and consent from much of the Iranian public that is evident on the streets right now. You've conferred legitimacy on the Islamic Republic, on the state, by making what was a war against the upper echelons of the government, whatever one's views on that, into a war on the country writ large. You killed over 165 kids in one double-tap strike. So the idea that Iran is now on the cusp of regime change, I don't think that could be further from the truth. It's certainly less true than it was a month ago. And whatever happened to putting America first? This is extraordinary. What about Americans? This guy is getting so excited about getting rid of this or that government in countries thousands of miles away. Now, of course, he has to pretend that's in the interest of the people that vote for him or vote for Donald Trump. He has to pretend that because otherwise he would look insane. He would look ridiculous. But fundamentally, he doesn't care about that. American politicians for a long time have given up on actually trying to improve America. It's too hard. There's too many special interests. It doesn't make you rich. It doesn't win you friends in powerful and influential places. It doesn't get you the great jobs on the side once you leave Congress. It doesn't help you fund a presidential bid. What does, however, is appealing to, like I say, powerful interests, particularly the Israel lobby. That's what the war in Iran is all about. Kieran, it's so striking. You know, I'm not a Trump supporter. I would never have voted for Donald Trump. I think if I was American, I wouldn't have voted for Kamala Harris either in the last presidential election. But there was something to that agenda of American economic nationalism, which I never thought he really believed in, but rhetorically it sounded very impressive, which was so powerful and so compelling, and actually, I think, was decisive in winning back, certainly in 2016, lots of former Democrat voters. People like Ted Cruz don't give a stuff about that. They're obsessed with foreign wars, intervention, regime change. It's crazy. It's almost, for me, and this might sound excessive, it's almost like a mental illness, this compulsion to focus on war abroad rather than actually trying to improve your own country, which, by the way, most governments in most places try and do most of the time.
Well, but if you're Ted Cruz, what are you going to do with your time? Because America is so corporatized. American free market capitalism is so pervasive. I mean, I've traveled across America a couple of times, and he's Texas, right? If you go through those heartlands, Aaron, it's astonishing. And look, I love parts of America. I think it's a very beautiful country geographically, but it is tragic. It's absolutely tragic what corporate power, special interests, and market capitalism have done to that country, to those communities. Now, you could argue it was a settler colonial country, and we can get into the history in a minute, because we need to talk about American Empire, I think, in a second, about, you know, its kind of inflection points. But yeah, it was a settler colonial country. Yeah, it was predicated on genocide. But the people that have been born there after and raised there, they grew up in a tragic situation in all but some kind of urban hotspots, in most cases, because corporate America, greed, and unfettered capitalism has absolutely eroded their potentially, you know, beautiful country. And if you're Ted Cruz, how are you going to stay relevant? You've got to rail against demographic change. And actually, American population has stayed relatively static over the past 20 years. It's another thing, you know. So where are you going to find your bugbears?
Well, they have to pretend that Latinos aren't European, right? That's
right,
one of them.
exactly. And Ted Cruz trying to square that circle was an interesting one. But he's partly what I was talking about, the Cuban, you know, and the Latin American, some elements of the Latin American lobby, or diaspora, as they call themselves. So, of course, they need to look to a different canvas. They need to tilt the table away from the American heartland, because actually, in simple terms, there's always this kind of complexity bias. You want to say, no, but it's more complicated than that. And of course, in some ways it is, but they have accomplished everything they wanted. The Reaganite revolution is so absolute, and in any case, was so far advanced before Reagan in the United States, that they have to turn outwards to find relevance, to remain relevant. You know, the whole world becomes the canvas after that. And I think that is a big part of, I think you're right. I think that's a big part of the explanation. It's like, you know, the do shit thesis. We need to do something. What are we for? We're irrelevant. We're a vestige, because so much of our program has been accomplished in America already.
But they do need to do something. But the point is, you've got 40 million people, until Trump did these reforms, you had 40 million people needing food stamps, right? Which is to say that if you don't have state intervention, 40 million people will be malnourished, right?
Right.
You have a situation where Chinese girls now, by the time they hit adolescence, are taller than American girls, which is to say that they're getting access to more protein in their diet, right? You have a situation where you're more likely to die in childbirth in the United States than you are in Bosnia.
Yes.
Right? And of course, people say, well, let's break it down by race, because racist right-wingers say that. Guess where rates of female maternal mortality are lowest? California. Very diverse place in terms of the US. So there are so many challenges for American politicians to address, and yet the greater those challenges are domestically, literally the more fucked up the country gets at home, it's almost, there's an inverse correlation. The more stuff they want to do overseas.
For sure. Let me explain let me qualify what I mean. Of course, America is full of poverty, neediness, greed. There is so much desperation in the United States. So if what you want to do, Aaron, is address that desperation and that grotesque inequality and all of those indicators that you just talked about, and there are a million of them, of course, there is so much work to do. And that's what's so frustrating, is that, of course, if that's what you're in the market for, if that's why you got into politics, there is an endless amount of work in the United States ahead of you. So that's not what I mean. What I mean is that Ted Cruz and those guys will never do that, because it's not why they got into politics. They got into politics for selfish reasons. They got into politics for their own motivations. I don't want to sort of armchair analyze them all at a psychological level, but clearly individual gain, power, greed, and making America as divisive as possible, which includes those poverty indicators that you just rightly pointed out. Those are parts of the, you know, that's the impetus for Ted Cruz and his ilk. And of course, they're ideologues, right? So if it conflicts with, you know, market capitalism as an idea, they won't do it. And they are fatally captured by special interests. So if it goes against the special interests, as indeed education, healthcare, all of those tough things that you just pointed out, that, you know, in the 1930s, FDR did some of, as soon as they hit any resistance on that from their special interest or their donors, they're never going to do it, because that's not why they got into politics. And so that's what I mean. In that context, they turn outwards to seem relevant, to feel relevant. They turn outwards to the rest of the world.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's not an advert for democracy, is it? You know, the extent to which rich people can just buy the political process. Oh, democracy, you can have NGOs and billionaires will buy the media, and actually your country will get worse and you'll just have permanent war. Doesn't sound good to me. Elsewhere in that interview, Ted Cruz went on to say this.
And the other challenge that you're facing is the Strait of Hormuz at the moment, because when you look at the natural resources going through there, the petroleum, the liquid natural gas, the fact that it's
fertilizer,
helium, the fact that it's been shut and it's been closed, and let's be honest, that is Iran's main trump card. That is a very real issue, not just for America, but for the globe in general.
Unquestionably, though, I will note the Europeans, who are more impacted by the Strait of Hormuz closing than America is, the Europeans have said, well, gosh, we don't like it, but we're not willing to do much about it.
I identify as Venezuelan.
That sounds very on brand for Europe at the moment, we say as Europeans, unfortunately.
What am I watching? What am I watching? These are the people that railed against identity politics, and I think Francis Foster is British. I'm Venezuelan. I know he's joking, but you have a clip there where an American politician is supporting a government, part of a government, it's his party, which is literally responsible for blocking the Strait of Hormuz, which, by the way, is going to lead, if things carry on as they are right now, is going to lead to a recession in Europe. We're not going to be able to access energy. We're going to have massive inflation. Interest rates will go up. If you have a student loan, good luck. Your student loan is going to start to get to 6, 7, 8%. Good luck remortgaging. You're going to pay an extra couple of £100 a month at least on your mortgage. If you're a renter, your landlord's going to have to pay more on their mortgage if they're remortgaging. You're buying food, the food inflation's going up. We had a year off from not getting poorer, and now we're going back, and it's literally directly attributable to the idiocy of the White House. And even then, because of course these people are blowing smoke up the arse of the American right, they have to say, well, we're sorry we can't support you in making us poorer. If only European politicians had the guts to support the White House in making Europe poorer, in making student loan interest even higher, in making it even more expensive to fill up your car. I wish they had the backbone, the resolve to support you in this brave endeavor. Utterly ridiculous. Now what that clip shows you, I think, is that the neocons won. Non-interventionist Don has become even worse than George W. Bush. I never thought I'd say that, by the way. Just when all the smart people were talking about the need for Washington to disentangle itself from West Asia and focus on China, they're trying to invade Iran. Now, is Iran a superpower? No. But it's a country whose population is 2/3 that of Russia, with a younger population and a culture of martyrdom held by millions of people. 2 years into his second presidency, and the Trump project has seemingly given up on any domestic agenda. I think that clip shows you that in spades. And I'm being serious, I've got evidence to this argument. Take Doge and reducing the size of the state. Remember when Trump and Elon were going to shrink the deficit and eventually the US debt? Well, it turns out that's going rather badly. This is from the Brookings Institution, a Washington-based think tank, a fortnight ago. Under the Congressional Budget Office's current projections for the next 10 years, primary deficits will average 2.1% of GDP. Net interest payments will rise from 3.2% of GDP in 2025, tied with 1991 as the all-time high, to 4.6% in 2036. So the interest payments are going to increase by about a third, and they're already at record highs, as the average nominal interest rate on government debt rises to exceed the nominal economic growth rate by 2031. This is a doom loop for the US economy. The unified deficit will approach 6.7% of GDP within 10 years. Even the cyclically adjusted deficit will exceed 6% of GDP. Debt will rise from 99% of GDP at the end of 2025, which is where it is right now, really, to 120% by 2036, well beyond the previous all-time high. Over the following 2 decades, the projected trends are even less auspicious. Sizable primary deficits persist indefinitely. the gap between the average nominal interest rate on government debt and the nominal economic growth rate continues to widen. I mean, any kind of gap is bad, but it's just getting wider, setting off the possibility of explosive debt dynamics. By 2056, relative to GDP, annual net interest payments reach 6.9%, the unified deficit reaches 9.1%, and the public debt stands at 175%. 175%. So Italian/Japanese levels, close to Italy, for the United States. All these figures would be all-time highs, except for the deficits during World War II, the financial crisis of 2008, and the first 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, those are all emergency situations, right? So outside of a war or a literal global plague or a rerun of the 1929 crash, we would see all-time highs and would continue to grow after 2056. Budget outcomes would be even worse under current policy projections. This is where it gets really funny. Or if you're American, maybe not. They incorporate more realistic policy choices than those required of the Congressional Budget Office in its baseline calculations. Making temporary tax provisions, such as those in the 2025 One Big Beautiful Bill Act, permanent. So Trump's quote-unquote temporary tax provisions, and we know when you do temporary tax cuts or tax rises, they generally become permanent. Making those permanent and making plausible assumptions about future discretionary spending to maintain government services would drive the debt-to-GDP ratio to 211% by 2056. This is from the guy that wants to reduce the debt. It's going to go from 99% to 120% to 175%, and if they keep the stuff that he's already pinned in as of last year, over 200% of GDP. Now, I know some people in the comments are saying, no, but they can print their own currency. They can, but people aren't going to buy the treasuries because they can't pay back the debt. They can do what they like. They're going to get a lot of inflation, and nobody's going to buy the treasuries. So the US can get away with printing money indefinitely because it's not seen as an outrageously bad bet. It's relatively safe, and because of the petrodollar. It's almost like Donald Trump is trying to blow up American empire on purpose. It's almost like he's trying to accelerate the demise of the petrodollar, American unipolarity, everything. Now, if you think I'm just taking one data point, deficits and the debt, which, by the way, is just astonishing, right? All we heard for a year was Doge. I'm going to cut the size of the state. And now what we're hearing is 211% debt to GDP ratio. Crazy. Let's go to the jobs data. This is even worse in a way, because it turns out the US lost 92,000 jobs in February. Sounds bad. What happened to tariffs on imports leading to American reindustrialization? Then there's this from Gallup, the pollster, who published this data earlier on today. New Gallup data confirmed the personal and professional environment of US workers was worse at the end of 2025 than at any point in the past 3 years across several important metrics. For the first time since Gallup began tracking the life evaluation of the US workforce, more workers report struggling in their lives, 49%, than thriving. For the first time, more are struggling in their lives than thriving, 49% to 46%. A stark reversal from 2022 and 2023, when more than half employees were classified as thriving. This is coupled with US worker engagement dropping to the lowest level on record in the past decade at 31% of engaged employees. So we've got the jobs data, we've got feedback from the American worker in terms of how they're feeling about things. We've got the deficit. It's not looking good. And then, of course, people say, well, the American economy is growing. It's booming. Hold your horses, because actually all of that is, guess what, debt fueled. Between 2020 and 2024, the US economy grew by $6 trillion. Sounds like a lot until you realize the debt increased by $12 trillion. In other words, for every dollar added with regards to debt, you're creating 50 cents of GDP. Normally, when you hear about a fiscal multiplier, it's $1 or £1 creates 2-3 pounds worth of GDP, or 5 or 10. In the immediate post-war context in the United States, about $1 generated $10 of value. Now, that's because of industrialization. Every year you add with regards to primary and secondary education creates a ton of value, and you get diminishing returns over time. Okay. But 12 trillion of debt and 6 trillion of economic growth is not good. And you add all the other stuff we're talking about, and all of a sudden, actually, the obsession with doubling down on war everywhere, all at the same time, Lebanon and Cuba and Iran and Venezuela and the West Bank, and God knows where next, starts to make sense. Kieran, the American right, American empire has always existed, and the American right has always been, I think, the most zealous with regards to prosecuting it. It's not to let the Democrats off the hook, but if you look at George W. Bush, you look at people immediately after World War II, you know, the voices that were strongest in terms of using nukes on Korea, for instance, they generally came from the US right. But it does feel that with the American economic model in crisis, with the social model in crisis, they're going down with all guns blazing. And I mean literally.
This is what happens when empires fail. I mean, historically, the pattern is very consistent. And yeah, US empire, I'm kind of hearing from lots of quarters at the moment, certainly not here, that US empire has never been in the US until relatively recently. You know, the Monroe Doctrine was proclaimed in 1824. That was 35 years, 40 years after the country was founded. So it's pretty early on. And then you're right that, you know, I would say the next big inflection point for American empire is the end of that century, 1898, the Spanish-American War, which was essentially a prosecution of, a realization of the Monroe Doctrine, which was, you will not do anything on the American continent, north or south. It's for the US to do it. So they kicked the Spanish out of Cuba and occupied Cuba. And went to the Philippines and did the same. And that was under Teddy Roosevelt. Well, it was under his predecessor, William McKinley, but he was a major driving force, and he's a Republican, of course. So yeah, tends to be the case. But even before that, Americans went into Mexico and colonized a lot of Mexico. Texas, Arizona, New Mexico all used to be Mexican territory in the Mexico War. So empire's always been pretty central to the US. And then, of course, the whole thing was manifest destiny, right? It went from one coast to the other and it colonized that land. That was a form of colonization or settler colonialism with an imperialist ideology behind it, manifest destiny, the white man's burden, as it was called. So yeah, look, that's just kind of American colonialism or imperialism 101. But I think it's important to say it. And now we get to a point where I don't think that there is much more for America to offer itself or the world. I don't want to repeat myself, but the social contract that underpinned the United States, if it ever existed at all, certainly does not today. And so that is part of the reason that empires, when they get to this stage in their histories, they tend to accelerate their own decline. They get stuck in a kind of tragic loop or a vicious cycle in which they start to try and do things that's in the narrow interest of the political class of the day, that isn't in the interest of the country, and certainly doesn't underwrite its longevity, precipitates its downfall much quicker than otherwise would have happened.
I mean, there's lots of examples of that, but then there are other examples. You look at Britain when it lost its empire. It was not like this. And there's an interesting hypothesis from Rana Dasgupta, who says that precisely because America doesn't have an extraterritorial empire, like the French, like the British, they can afford to be even more exploitative in a way. So we view this as a more progressive form of empire. His argument is actually it's in many ways more exploitative. There isn't formal slavery and all kinds of things like that, but in terms of actual value being moved from one part of the planet to another, it's much more efficient, is his view. And also they can afford to be less pragmatic. So when you've got an extraterritorial empire to administer, like the British in India or the French in other parts of the world, they make huge mistakes. They kill people, Amritsar massacre, Algerian war, etc. But you at least have to consider, if I do X, they'll do that. If I make this choice or this choice, there'll be different outcomes. Whereas, like you said, with these regimes or these states being a black box, they just look at Venezuela as, okay, well, what output are we getting? If we're not getting the right output, kill somebody and let's see what other outputs they do. Because they literally don't have to administer that country. They don't have thousands of soldiers there in a way that the French or British did in their empires. So we're looking almost at this unique situation where you have the imperial hegemon in decline. It doesn't have the extraterritorial empire, so it doesn't need to be as quote-unquote pragmatic. And also, it's protected by these two giant oceans. So the world can go to shit as a result of American foreign policy choices, but broadly speaking, it's insulated, broadly speaking. The Europeans will get the energy inflation. The Asians will get the deindustrialization, and the Russians and Europeans will get the displaced people and the refugees. And America gets none of it. So they can keep on making these crazy, outlandish, destructive choices, and actually the disincentives for them to stop doing that are quite low. And that's what terrifies me more than anything, right? You know, the Europeans could destroy West Asia, the Middle East. They could destroy it. And you get 50 million people as refugees coming into Europe, and then all of a sudden Europeans, even on the right, would say, well, I don't want this is crazy. But that doesn't happen for the median Republican voter. So I'm kind of worried. I mean, fortunately, they're gonna, or unfortunately for them, but fortunately from a geopolitical perspective, energy price rises, I would hope, will be something of a wake-up call for the Trump voter. We talked about this a bit before we came on air. We're gonna finish up in a minute, but I think it's a really interesting conversation. I said, when Trump dies, I'll be happy, okay? You can clip that, you can clip that. I'm not gonna celebrate it, but I'll be happy. Inside, I'm not gonna lie to you guys, inside I'll be happy. The guy is responsible for millions of people dying, I think, right now. That's the trajectory over the next 2 years. I will be a happy person, I won't celebrate it. By the way, it's a sin for me to think that, I know, but I'm not gonna lie about it. And I think that, my view is, this is going so badly that if the next 2 years are like the last year, I think lots of Republicans, particularly in sort of elite circles, will try and distance themselves from what he's doing. What do you think?
First of all, I'm delighted you've said that on air, and I will throw my towel in with you and say, I'll be happy too. I'm sure, can I say something briefly about what you said before, about empire?
Please.
Very briefly. First of all, I think very interesting points, and definitely there are differences, huge differences, which we'd be remiss not to pay attention to. But there is an argument that Britain's kind of violent war moment was World War I, first of all, and that was the violent war moment that marked the beginning of the decline for all European empires. And actually, I think in Britain that holds true than it does in France. I think it really was a catastrophe for empire, for the British Empire. So I think that's the first point. The second point is there's always been this tension within America. So I can talk about American imperialism, American colonization, manifest destiny and so on, but it is true that unlike with the British Empire, where there was this huge doctrine, all this infrastructure behind it, designed to reproduce the idea of empire, in the United States, some members of the elite have been genuinely committed to isolationism from the beginning. And that created a tension, I think, within the United States, which meant that it was never totally sure of its empire-building project in some instances, and that in the end conditioned it in some ways. So that's also another point on that. Do I think Republicans are going to distance themselves from him? Of course they will. Of course they will. They will distance themselves from him as soon as he falls on his own sword. As soon as he's out of power, they will come out of the wings to criticize him, to mark themselves out as distinct from him, to pretend to offer a distinct political program. That's just the way politics works. You know, when somebody's in vogue, when somebody's in season, when they're all powerful in your end of the political spectrum, as Trump was, you dummy up and you get behind them, unless you've got integrity, unless you've got some integrity. If you don't, as most of them don't, you dummy up, you get behind them, you're all smiles, you pretend. And then as soon as they're out of fashion, out of season, you line up with the assassins. That's how it works for people who don't have integrity. And unfortunately, that describes 97% of the political class on both sides of the Atlantic. Not 100%, but about 97%. That's just total arbitrary quantification.
I don't know. I think you're being a bit unfair on the UK. Although I should say, nobody in the government, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, maybe in the chat, maybe correct me, I don't know. Nobody in the UK is saying we're about to go into recession because of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is going to cause a recession in this country. Your mortgage is going to get more expensive. Your energy bills are going to go up because of the Trump session. Don't call it inflation. Call it Trumpflation. That's what it is. Before we go, I want to play a clip from a Trump speech last year that he gave in Saudi Arabia. Have a look.
Before our eyes, a new generation of leaders is transcending the ancient conflicts of tired divisions of the past and forging a future where the Middle East is defined by commerce, not chaos, where it exports technology, not terrorism, and where people of different nations, religions, and creeds are building cities together, not bombing each other out of existence. We don't want that. And it's crucial for the wider world to note this great transformation has not come from Western interventionists or flying people in beautiful planes giving you lectures on how to live and how to govern your own affairs. No, the gleaming marvels of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi were not created by the so-called nation builders, neocons, or liberal nonprofits like those who spent trillions and trillions of dollars failing to develop Kabul, Baghdad, so many other cities. Instead, the birth of a modern Middle East has been brought by the people of the region themselves, the people that are right here, the people that have lived here all their lives, developing your own sovereign countries, pursuing your own unique visions and charting your own destinies in your own way. It's really incredible what you've done. In the end, the so-called nation builders wrecked far more nations than they built, and the interventionists were intervening in complex societies that they did not even understand themselves. They told you how to do it, but they had no idea how to do it themselves. Peace, prosperity, and progress ultimately came not from a radical rejection of your heritage, but rather from embracing your national traditions and embracing that same heritage that you love so dearly.
They had no idea. They had no idea what they were doing. They thought they could bomb you into democracy, and they thought intervention would make a difference. That was in 2025. I mean, he sounds like a completely different guy. And I have to say, when I saw that speech, and of course he's just reading from an article, he sounds quite bored, frankly. But in terms of the contents of the speech, I thought that was the best speech given by a US president in my lifetime about that part of the world. There was some recognition of state sovereignty. There's still US empire, of course, but it was a different kind of imperial relationship. It's almost like a co-partnership, which was quite different to the patrician overlord relationship that America had to the Middle East and West Asia really since the Second World War, right? So what's changed, Kieran? Either he's even more senile now than he was then, tick. Special interests are even more powerful now than they were then, tick. Or somebody has something on him. I'm not talking about the Epstein files, of course, I would never say that. Something really serious has changed, right? Because he's now saying and doing the complete opposite of those words from last year.
Well, I think it's a number of things. I think, first of all, you're right. He's more senile than he was, but he was pretty senile then. But I think more important than that, because you can keep a senile politician going for a while if you have people around them. I think that we've said this before, I've said this before on the show, everything that Trump says or writes or whatever is written in disappearing ink. You know, you really can't. We could do this all day. We could find clips, we could contrast them. I think a sort of technical way of putting it is that the incentive structure changed in the sort of intervening year or two. The reality is that I don't think that you can measure anything Trump says against anything else he says over a long period of time and expect it to stay the same. So I think that's another really important thing. And I think we don't know how historians will write about this era in 100 years or 50 years or 20 years. But I do think that will obviously, the constant chaos will be a key part of that logic. The other thing is, we shouldn't overlook that the Gulf is a key part of his, the Abraham Accords, it's a key part of American imperialism, right? And there he's appealing to Gulf states. And of course, what he's saying is you're right, it's true. Excuse me. He's saying we can't just prize open your states and assume that they're all the same and then, mix the formula up a bit and expect the same results. All those are things that you and I support in principle, but it is also important to understand the Gulf state context there and the kind of the inside-outside interests going on. So, outside or inside from the American perspective would be the Abraham Accords and the kind of business dealings around that. It's just good old-fashioned US capitalism chugging along as it always has. So business as usual, continuity on that front. And then the kind of inside-out interests. So Vision 2030 from Saudi Arabia's point of view. and bin Salman's attempts to try and normalize Saudi Arabia and bring it out from I was going to say the cold, but that's not a very good analogy for a Gulf state. But you know what I mean? And so I think that's an important part of the context as well. So there is some rupture in what he's saying, but it's also business as usual continuity. But yeah, I think the overriding thing is, he's been captured by new special interests, and in any case, it's very difficult to trust anything he says over any kind of period of time.
I think that's true. The disappearing ink thing is absolutely true, but I also do just think he's senile. I think he's losing the plot.